Another attempt at peace. France hosts an international conference to try and persuade Israeli and Palestinian diplomats back to the negotiating table. But they aren't at the Paris talks. So, is there still hope for a two-state solution? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Rigged and futile. That's how Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu describes a summit in France to try and find peace with the Palestinians. Delegates from 70 countries met in Paris to try and jumpstart stalled talks and reaffirm their support for a two-state solution. But Israelis and Palestinian diplomats weren't there to hear what was said. While Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas welcomed the summit, Prime Minister Netanyahu dismissed the talks. He says only bilateral negotiations have a chance of being successful. The French Foreign Minister says a two-state solution is the only possible way to ensure peace in the region.
It is not time to give up because the urgency remains. The two sides remain very distant in a relationship of distrust, which is particularly dangerous. No one is safe from a violence erupting again. Our common responsibility is to, from now on, succeed in bringing Israelis and Palestinians to the negotiating table.
Natasha Butler is in Paris with more.
Well, the French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault here in Paris has said that the aim of this conference is really to try and motivate, to encourage the Israelis and the Palestinians to restart talks, to try and create the kind of international climate for that to happen. Now, there are 70 countries represented here, that they'll also call on both sides to stop the violence and on Israelis to end illegal settlement building. These, of course, are issues which are seen as eroding any chance of moving towards a two-state solution. Now, the Israelis and the Palestinians are not here. The French President Francois Hollande had invited both sides to be briefed after this conference on the outcome of what was decided here, what was discussed here. However, the Israeli Prime Minister has refused to come, declined the invitation. The Palestinians say that Mahmoud Abbas will come to Paris in the coming weeks.
Now, the talks in Paris is the latest attempt to keep alive hopes for a two-state solution. The previous direct talks between Israelis and Palestinians broke off without agreement 3 years ago, and many differences remain. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution last month condemning the building of more Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian territory. Another sticking point is the status of Jerusalem. Both Israelis and Palestinians want the city to be their capital. And another complication is Donald Trump, who suggested he'll move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem when he becomes president. The French Foreign Minister says that would be a provocation with serious consequences. Well, let's bring in our guest. Mustafa Barghouti is Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative and joins us from Moscow. Mitchell Barak is a former spokesman for President Shimon and joins me from West Jerusalem. And Ben White is the author and researcher on Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and joins me from Cambridge in England. Welcome to all of my guests here on Inside Story. Let me just begin with a short statement from all of you. If I just read this initial question to you. It's another conference, another chance to focus on the impasse and disagreements of the past 6 decades. Analysts, think tanks, politicians, stakeholders all agree that there'll be no breakthrough or a solution to the resumption of talks at the Paris conference. So, Mustafa Barghouti, let me just begin with you. A short answer. What is the best that can come out of these talks for the Palestinians?
Well, first of all, it's not just a conference. Actually, it reflects the international worry about Israeli policy, about the fact that settlements are killing the possibility of two-state solution and the possibility for peace. And it's an outcry to try to save the possibility of a solution. The best thing that can come out of this conference, in my opinion, is 3 things. First of all, immediate recognition of the Palestinian state, since all countries participating have already recognized Israel. They need to recognize Palestine to impose a diplomatic fact on the ground. Second, a very clear decision demanding the immediate halt and of all Israeli illegal settlement activities, whether in the West Bank or in Jerusalem. And finally, clear indication to Israel that if it proceeds with these actions of settlement building, this would mean that the international community could engage in sanction actions as they have done in other countries.
OK, Mitchell Barak, you've heard what Mustafa Barghouti had to say in Moscow. Your Prime Minister is dismissing this meeting, this conference, however we want to describe it. What do you think Israel can take from the conference? Because there will be some sort of final declaration, I'm sure.
Right, but you know, a declaration of countries that doesn't include the two countries or the two peoples that are partners or need to be partners in this conflict, the Israelis and Palestinians, is a stillborn from the beginning. Meaning it's not going to affect, if they want to be influential, both of them need to be influential to put the Israelis and Palestinians in direct bilateral talks and negotiations. And it's a little bit strange, this thing. It's almost like they rented the ballroom when they still thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. You know, to have a conference like this less than a week when there's not only an administration change in the U.S., but a different party is going to take over the U.S. government, and a totally different political model in the nature and in the form of Donald Trump as president. So there's a lot of unknowns here. It seemed that it would be wise for the countries that are organizing it, France and the other countries that are participating, to say, hey, you know, maybe we could put this off a few weeks to see really what develops between what happens in the region, because everything that is, it doesn't matter what comes out of this at this point, because it's predetermined anyway. And all bets are off after January 20th, next week. After there's a new president, there's going to be new policies. There's going to be new policies towards Israel, towards the Palestinians, towards Africa, towards Europe, towards the United Nations. And I think people will be very surprised as to what comes out. And even if people think that they're, you know, going to be fully supported, let's wait and see. But to use the influence, get the Israelis and Palestinians together, and from the Israeli perspective, get the Palestinians to renounce terror, renounce violence, and, you know, there was just a terror attack here. Say something about it. Abbas should say something about it, and he hasn't.
We'll come back to the Trump issue later on in the programme, because there's a lot to discuss there. I just want to just hit the main points. Let's go over to Ben White in Cambridge. Ben, we've seen conferences like this historically throughout the last 6 decades. We see the two main parties that the international community is talking about not in attendance. How different is this particular conference meeting compared to the other international gatherings we've had in the past?
I mean, while it would be excellent if there were the sort of outcomes that Mustafa mentioned, I think realistically we have to have pretty low expectations from the gathering in Paris today. And to my mind, that's because a lot of the assumptions of this conference are shaped by the same assumptions that have governed the peace process, the so-called peace process, that has been primarily US and European state-led. And that peace process has been going on really for about half of the entire 50 years that Israel has been occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And the problem with that peace process, and that's reflected in the gathering today, is that it has imposed a false symmetry on an occupier and an occupied, and sort of implied that they both have mutual responsibilities and obligations. The peace process has also actually served to immunize Israel from accountability in international fora. And in terms of its end goal, which has become increasingly explicit in recent years, the end goal of preserving Israel as a so-called Jewish state, that peace process is actually subordinating Palestinian rights to the goal of preserving Israel's ethnocratic character. So to the extent that today's conference is reflecting that framework, I think we have to be quite pessimistic about what can actually emerge from it.
OK. Mustafa Barghouti, let me just bring you in here, as well as Mitchell Barak. We know that at the present moment, both the Palestinians and the Israelis are poles apart, and even this programme is not going to be able to get you both to agree on many of the points. But Mustafa Barghouti, is this a missed opportunity, perhaps, for even low-level talks, low-level diplomats, maybe from the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government, to try and talk on the sidelines of this sort of conference, had they wanted to?
Listen, we have to remember that Oslo Agreement was concluded more than 23 years ago. According to that agreement, both sides had to finish negotiating all final status issues, and a Palestinian state should have been established after 6 years in 1999. We've already passed that date by 17 years, during which time Israel has increased the number of illegal settlements from 100,000 settlers to more than 750,000 settlers today and so many new settlements. This is a very dangerous path. I think Ben White was very clear and very correct when he said you cannot equate between the Israelis and Palestinians. One side is occupying the other. One side is oppressing the other. Israel has created not only the longest occupation in modern history, almost 50 years, but has created already a system of apartheid, a system of racial discrimination, and it is killing every opportunity for peace. Mr. Netanyahu was invited for peace talks in Moscow, and he rejected that. Mr. Netanyahu was invited with Mr. Abbas to Paris. Mr. Abbas accepted, and Netanyahu refused to come. That's why both sides are not there. Mr. Netanyahu was invited even by the Egyptian president, and he refused to go. So in reality, we see here an Israeli government that wants only one thing: more time to finish the process of killing the possibility of peace, more time to kill the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state, more time to kill the possibility of hope for the future. And that should be stopped. The world community must stop using different standards for different problems. The double standard did not serve the cause of peace. Let's remember why the world community has imposed sanctions on Russia, claiming that because it has annexed territories from Ukraine, while it's not imposing any sanctions on Israel. On the contrary, the American president, new president, is promising to move his embassy to Jerusalem.
And we'll talk about that later.
In such a way that would mean participating in violating international law and participating in the crime of annexing East Jerusalem. There has to be actions. If the world community cares about peace, they should impose sanctions on Israel to eliminate this situation, which is dangerous for both people, the Palestinians and the Israelis in the long run.
OK, let me bring in Mitchell Barak here. I'd like you to address what Mustafa Barghouti had to say there, sir. Would you agree? You obviously don't.
Well, first of all, I mean, I would think, they've made this urgent thing that it has to be, 5-6 days before President Obama leaves office. It's Secretary of State John Kerry's last hurrah is going to come. First of all, I hope they find time to discuss what's going on in Syria. Meaning, I think the death toll there is only 500,000 people now, and there's real human rights violation and real war crimes. I know it's not Syria, but when you have 70 countries together,
why do you get
meaning
Syria into the issue
there's
now?
something wrong with the
because you want to avoid
because
the
there's something wrong with the priority.
Mr. Barghouti,
no, I'm happy to talk about Israel.
Let Mr. Barak have his say, and then you can redress that,
sorry,
sir.
okay, fine.
Mr. Barak.
There's something wrong with the priorities of both the United Nations that has to slam through on New Year's Eve weekend, something condemning the Israeli settlements, and 70 nations getting together in Paris. You would think maybe to rebuild, Syria, Aleppo, maybe give safety to. There are people that are dying today there because they have no electricity. Now, I'm not saying in any way that that's an excuse for Israel, and I don't want to divert the attention there. But I do want to say that if the world community is serious about regional peace, about human rights in the region, then you know what? Maybe they should spend a few minutes on Syria there. That's my only point. But let me go back to your point. Getting Israelis and Palestinians together is very important. And I think that this Prime Minister and President Abbas should be encouraged to do that. I know that Netanyahu has invited Abbas from the United Nations in his speech to address the Knesset. He should call his bluff. And he should call his bluff. I watched the incoming Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, in front of the Senate committee, and they asked him about Israel, and they asked him about the Palestinians. He said, it's not enough to say that you're against terror. You have to prevent it. And the impression from the Israeli side is, and here's where what you said, Ben White, false symmetry takes place. I think you can't confuse the arsonists with those that are fighting the fires. And if you have people here that are engaging in terror, supporting terror, the widow of this truck driver who rammed into Israeli soldiers and killed them on a sidewalk is now getting a pension from the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority chairman, Abbas, is being photographed with showing photographs of being with terror. The Palestinian Authority is still naming streets and soccer stadiums.
But Mr. Barak,
in that
so
there is a false
Mr. Barak, in the same
there.
sense, you have Israeli supporters waving flags and supporting an Israeli soldier who was convicted of murdering a wounded Palestinian attacker. He may have been, but he was still alive, according to the Israeli military court. And is it any wonder then that the Palestinians get angry with that sort of scenario when they see that? It's a fight that happens on both sides.
Anger, but when you have it go through a court of law, and the court of law says you do not, the person did come. Everyone agrees he was a terrorist. Everyone agrees he tried to attack soldiers. Everyone agreed he stabbed a soldier, and then he was neutralized or seemed to be neutralized. And the mistake is that the soldier got out of hand and wanted, according to the court, and should not have killed him. But we have a court of law to say you can't do that. You can't even take a terrorist who tried to kill you and your friends and execute him. And that's what we do. Okay. We're not naming a soccer stadium, paying a pension. This is why there is not peace. This is why we can't come to the table. And I think that if we would use the efforts now of a peace conference for both sides together and say, hey, we really need to discuss what's going on before the region explodes, that would be a good use of time, effort, and people's energy in a region.
Okay, let me just go to Ben White before I come back to you, Mr. Barghouti. Ben, it seems that the international community itself needs to try and find a way that can bring both sides on board. They have tried, they continue to try, they will in the future as well. But there seems to be, perhaps, with the new administration coming into the White House, we know America is a firm supporter of Israel. Are we heading towards loggerheads where we're going to, for the next 4 years, see a scenario where it's the US and Israel versus the rest of the world? Is that a real worry? Is that a possibility?
Sure. Just one quick point there about the Mitchell Barak's comments there. I mean, yes, Israel has, quote unquote, the rule of law, but the trial of Elo Azariah, the soldier convicted of manslaughter, is an exception and a very unique exception. Israeli soldiers shoot and kill or maim Palestinians routinely in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and never face anything like due process or accountability. As to your question, I mean, the international community is not powerless to actually have a positive impact in this situation. There are tools at the international community's disposal, at the US's disposal, at European states' disposal, to actually apply effective pressure on Israel, which is the occupier, Israel, which is a serial violator of international law and of human rights for decades now, that just lacks the political will to use those tools. And of course, in terms of what's coming up with Trump entering the White House, Netanyahu today, excuse me if this is not the exact quote, but he said something like, he described the Paris conference as the death throes of sort of yesterday's world. And it very much echoes Trump's tweet at the time of the passing of UN Resolution 2334 last month about how things will be different after January the 20th when he comes into power. Now, I think it's likely that under Trump, at the very best, there will be a hands-off approach to the question of Israel-Palestine, which, by the way, if you want to understand why that benefits Israel, it's the same answer as to the question, why does Israel keep on insisting that there must be direct bilateral talks? Because, of course, there's not a problem with negotiations or talks per se, it's the conditions in which they take place. And when you have one side with so much power and another side without, when you're talking about an occupier and occupied, then, of course, direct talks benefits or favors, is a dynamic that favors the powerful. So Trump will either have hands-off, or the Trump administration might, and we have numerous indicators for this, will sort of support and boost those elements within the Israeli government who prefer even more extreme measures than those already taken. There might be an acceleration of different settlement and colonization activities, or even annexation of different parts of the occupied territory.
Well, while Mr. Barak is shaking his head, I want to go back to Mustafa Barghouti in Moscow. And the approach now, regardless of this conference, the conference will end. How do the Palestinians now proceed in getting their case across? Because the one thing perhaps that we all seem to see is that when the Palestinians make their case in a much larger international forum, they get much larger international media coverage, awareness of the plight, if for a want of a better word. What is the next move now for the Palestinian Authority after this conference?
Well, I agree with you. We need to have better information to the world about our situation. But let me explain here that the fact that the Paris conference was held against Israel's will reflects actually how much the international community is really fed up with Israel's policy. It's exactly the same applies to the most recent resolution of the United Nations Security Council resolution, which was supported by 14 members out of 15, which also reflects how much the world is worried about the issue of settlements. In the case of Iran, everybody was supportive of an international process. And it was an international process that resolved the problem of the conflict with Iran. In the case of Syria, we already see so many international conferences and so many international interventions. Why, when it comes to Palestine, it is forbidden for the international community to interfere? We have tried direct negotiations. We have tried bilateral negotiations for 23 years. All Israel wants is to put us inside a room and dictate their will on us, abusing the imbalance of power between us and them. What we are trying to do here is to bring in the international law, the international community. We are trying to bring in the peoples of the world, exactly like South African people have done when they fought against the system of apartheid.
Sure.
If Israel really wants negotiations, could it declare that it is ready to end the occupation? Can it declare that it is ready to implement the resolution of the International Court of Justice, which is the highest judiciary body in the world, and remove the wall which has become the apartheid wall? Is it ready to end settlement activities and allow Palestinians to have East Jerusalem as part of their state? Of course, the answer is no. Israel is an occupying power. Israel is an oppressive power. It is conducting settlement colonialism. And things will not change till we change the balance of power.
Okay, Mr. Barghouti, let me just bring in.
Part of changing the balance of power.
I think you've stated certainly, sir. I think you've stated certainly your position very clearly. Mitchell Barrett, let me just bring you in here. Was there? You've heard what Mr. Barghouti says. We've heard this before from both sides to a certain extent. Was there ever a time when you were with President Perez that you felt, or he felt, there was an opportunity for a breakthrough?
Yeah, I mean, I think President Peres worked for that. I think he had, I mean, I used to see some of the Palestinian legislators be snuck into the president's house at night so that they could meet with him. There's certainly, you know, an interest to do it. But let me say
is there a genuine will, though? I mean, I know you're not in government now. I know you're not sort of advising senior ministers, the president or prime minister.
Yes.
But you know, is there a will in Israel, you know, a ground reality that a two-state solution is the way forward?
I can tell you that there is, because nobody wants to continue this. And let me just say a few things. First of all, after the great electoral miracle of Donald Trump being elected, which surprised many people, I think the second great miracle of election proportion that we're seeing in the Middle East is that Abbas and Netanyahu have both outlived Obama. Meaning 8 years of Obama has been both Abbas and Netanyahu. And I'm saying that, and it's half a joke, but you know, maybe these two people are not the best representatives of their people as far as who's going to move things forward. And maybe it has to be the next generation of leadership or the next leaders that come forward. I know that President Abbas has started the 12th year of his 4-year term, and Netanyahu is close to being the longest serving prime minister. Excuse me?
Meanwhile, what happens?
So,
we should wait, wait?
Right. No. So meanwhile, Meanwhile, no, we shouldn't wait. So here's where I think the opportunity lies. Meaning, President Trump is now going to be, President-elect Trump will now be President Trump by the end of the week, by Friday afternoon. And that really could present an opportunity. Meaning, and I understand, and many people will agree with what Ben White has said here, is that he's going to take a hands-off approach, and he has already made statements through the selection of his ambassador and his willingness to, we don't know whether he's going to move the embassy or he's just going to move the ambassador to Jerusalem.
Coming to the end of the program, Mr. Barrett,
a provocation. Okay, so let me sum up and say, I think there's a real opportunity, and the opportunity is from the Palestinian point of view, they need to come to the new administration and say, we're ready to renounce terror, we're ready to fight terror, bring the Israelis to the table, because the Israelis will not be able to say no to President Trump.
How many times
if President Trump says, here's what you guys have to do, then here's what you guys have to do, the Israelis will have a difficulty. It's not like Obama. It's not like Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry.
Yep.
As soon as Trump will say, here's how I want the deal to go down, it will be very difficult for Israelis to say
We'll
no.
certainly see what does happen. Ben White, very quickly, 15 seconds. What would you like to see happen post-conference, and how quickly can it happen?
Well, it's very clear that the international community have to apply the tools of pressure at their disposal, including sanctions and embargoes, on Israel, the occupier, with the basic goal of enabling the Palestinian people's basic rights that have been denied so long.
Well, we'll see what does happen in the coming weeks and months. But let me thank all of our guests, to Mustafa Barghouti in Moscow, Mitchell Barak in West Jerusalem, and Ben White there in Cambridge. Thanks so much for your time on Inside Story. And thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation with us on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. You've been watching Inside Story. I'm Sohail Rahman, and from all of the team, thanks very much for your time and your company. Bye-bye for now.